Tonight, we descend into Düsseldorf of 1929, a city of flickering gas lamps, ration queues, and silence broken only by the rattle of trams. On the banks of the Rhine, the fog curls thick as wool, swallowing footsteps, blurring faces. And in that fog, something stirs, a figure who waits, who watches, who follows. A young seamstress, late from work, hurries past factory gates. Behind her, the rhythm of shoes on cobblestone quickens. She glances back, but the street is empty. Only the echo answers. Hours later, the city wakes to horror. A body discovered near the edge of an alley, her throat marked in ways that defy reason. The police call it murder. The people call it something else. They whisper of a vampire, a man who drinks not only life but fear itself. Doors are bolted, windows latched, yet on brick walls across Düsseldorf, a single phrase seems etched into every mind, though no one dares to write it. Who walks among us when the lamps go dark? What began as one death became a storm with a name, Peter Kürten, and Düsseldorf for years would be his hunting ground. They found the girl in the early hours of summer morning, crumpled in a dark alley like a broken doll, discarded by some cruel child. Her body bore the marks of something more than violence. It was ritualistic, obscene in its precision, a policeman, hardened by years of war and poverty, staggered backward when he saw the glistening streak on her throat. It wasn't just that she had been taken from life. It was the way the blood had been drained, as if by an invisible mouth that refused to let go. Düsseldorf woke up to headlines whispering the impossible. There was a creature walking among them, one that did not kill for money, jealousy, or even rage, but for hunger. The whisper spread quickly through the crowded beer halls and church pews. Mothers gripped their daughters tighter. Men walked their wives home after dusk. And yet, the creature did not hide. He walked the same streets as his victims, blending in with the ordinary shuffle of life, as if mocking the entire city. They called him the Monster Düsseldorf, though some whispered an even darker title, the Vampire. What haunted people wasn't just the bodies he left behind, but the way he seemed to drink from them. Police reports, quietly circulated, never officially published, described wounds that looked less like knife cuts and more like something animal, feral. Imagine living in a city where every shadow might contain a man who fed on your lifeblood, a man who enjoyed the act more than the result. And the cruelest part? This wasn't a tale from some medieval nightmare. It wasn't a superstition. It was a man with a name, a face, and an address. His name was Peter Kürten. And before he confessed, before he smiled his way to the gallows, he walked as freely as you or I, an apex predator disguised as a neighbor. The opening scene of this story isn't just about death. It's about the unbearable idea that monsters do exist, that they can sit beside you on a train, hold the door open for you, nod politely in the marketplace, and still dream of the moment they'll cut your throat just to watch you tremble. The first victim wasn't the last, and the terror that gripped Düsseldorf would only grow. Each new crime more grotesque, more taunting, until the city itself seemed to pulse with paranoia, as if the vampire had sunk his teeth not just into flesh, but into the psyche of an entire people. Picture Germany in the late 1920s, a nation fractured by defeat, humiliation, and hunger. The Treaty of Versailles had cut deep, carving away pride and stability, leaving behind a wound that refused to heal. Cities like Düsseldorf were pressure cookers, industrial hubs teeming with restless workers, disillusioned veterans, and a political atmosphere that oscillated between revolutionary fire and crushing despair. The streets smelled of coal smoke and cheap beer. At night, the glow of gas lamps revealed half-starved children picking through garbage, prostitutes standing in doorways, and men stumbling out of taverns to brawl in the gutter. The economy was crumbling. Inflation made money nearly worthless. Life was cheap, survival brutal. People were distracted by politics, by empty stomachs, by the endless grind of existence. And in that distracted darkness, someone like Peter Kürten could thrive. What made it all worse was the contrast. By day, Düsseldorf could look almost respectable. There were theaters, department stores, churches ringing their bells with stubborn optimism. But the shadows between those facades were thick and inviting, the kind of shadows that swallow screams before they reach the air. Germany at that time was obsessed with stories of monsters. Newspapers were filled with tales of murderers, perverts, and strange supernatural rumors. In a city where unemployment was rampant and homes were overcrowded, imagination became both an escape and a weapon. When children went missing, when a young woman failed to return home, people did not simply assume robbery or domestic quarrels. They whispered about a vampire walking among them. And the terrifying truth was, they weren't entirely wrong. Kürten's Düsseldorf was a place where law enforcement was underfunded, riddled with bureaucracy, and often more concerned with political unrest than with the bodies showing up in alleys. There were too many crimes, too few answers, and a police force that often chalked up killings to ordinary violence. The perfect hunting ground. And think of the psychology of the time. This was a society where violence was already normalized. Veterans returned from the First World War with dead eyes, haunted by trenches and gas attacks, men who had killed and survived killing. For them, brutality wasn't shocking. It was familiar. Kurten understood this. He weaponized it. In a city anesthetized to suffering, he knew his acts would not just horrify. They would numb, paralyze, and then linger like a sickness in the marrow of the city. The setting wasn't just a backdrop to his crimes. It was the incubator. Without Düsseldorf's chaos, its desperation, its shadows, Peter Kürten would have been an anomaly. But in that time, in that place, he was almost inevitable. Peter Kürten looked like no one worth remembering. That was his camouflage. He wasn't tall, wasn't striking, didn't carry himself like a predator in some dime novel caricature. He was ordinary, forgettable, a man you'd pass on the tram without a second glance, the kind of neighbor who might nod politely, maybe even tip his hat. But that was the illusion. Behind those pale eyes lived a storm so twisted it felt less human and more like a parasite wearing skin. He was born in 1883, in a home so rotten it seemed designed to manufacture cruelty. His father was a tyrant, a man who drank and raged, beating his wife and children with a routine that blurred into ritual. The family lived in squalor, dirty, cramped rooms where privacy was a myth and abuse echoed off the walls. For Peter, childhood wasn't innocence. It was training. Pain became language, violence, currency. And like so many future monsters, he didn't just suffer. He learned to enjoy watching others suffer too. The boy's education in cruelty started early. There are stories of him drowning puppies, of standing over small animals with the detached curiosity of a scientist who treats blood as ink and fears music. Some children smash ants to feel power. Peter wanted more than power. He wanted intimacy with agony. He wanted to drink it in. By adolescence, he had already committed assaults that blurred the line between crime and compulsion. Prison became his second home, though each stay only honed his taste for dominance. Behind bars, he absorbed stories of infamous criminals, shaping his identity around them like a dark apprenticeship. And when he stepped back into the world, he wasn't rehabilitated. He was rehearsed. But here's the truly unnerving part. Kürten could be charming. He married, held jobs, and convinced people he was just another working-class man beaten down by circumstance. His wife, herself scarred by a failed marriage and social shame, saw him as a chance at stability. How cruel fate must have felt to her, to realize too late that her husband's stability was a mask stretched tight over a gaping void. The duality is almost unbearable. Peter Kürten, the polite tenant, the helpful neighbor. Peter Kürten, the sadist whose veins thrummed with desire at the sight of blood. He once admitted that watching crimson flow gave him a sensation like, well, let's say it was closer to ecstasy than anger. That is the level of depravity we're dealing with. In Düsseldorf, people thought monsters lived in stories, in vampire folklore, in the pages of gothic novels. They didn't realize the real monster rented rooms, walked streets, and smiled as he plotted who he would drain next. Peter Kürten was not a man who lost control. He was a man who thrived on it. The city's first taste of the vampire came quietly, almost too quietly, like the first crack in a dam no one realizes is about to burst. In 1929, a little girl named Rosa Olliger disappeared on her way home. She was just 8. Children vanished in those days with disturbing regularity. Poverty, predators, and neglect all conspired within the ranks of the young. But Rosa's case was different. When she was found, the world seemed to tilt sideways. Her small body had been desecrated in ways that went beyond violence. There were wounds, too precise, too intentional, and there was the unsettling evidence that her blood had been taken. Not spilled, not wasted, but savored. The authorities wanted to smother the details, bury the truth before panic took root. But rumors are like smoke. They escape, they spread, they choke. Word traveled through tenement walls and across tavern tables. Someone had drained the child. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Whispers of a vampire walks among us, crawling into the city's collective nightmare. Kurten himself later confessed the crime, but at the time, no one suspected the polite man with the steady gaze and the dull job. He even joined in the public hysteria, walking through the very streets where people whisper about a monster, smiling at their fear, feeding off it like an unseen banquet. Rosa's death should have been the moment Düsseldorf recognized the storm on the horizon. But in cities drowning in crime, one more tragedy hardly raises alarm. The police filed their reports, the papers softened the details, and life staggered on. And in that apathy, Kurten felt emboldened. He had discovered something intoxicating. Not only could he kill, but he could terrify. His crimes were not just about the body. They were about possession of the city soul. Soon, there were other victims. A young woman walking home alone after a date. A mechanic ambushed at night. A servant girl whose throat bore strange marks that looked less like cuts and more like bites. And each time, the city grew more restless, more suspicious, more certain that they weren't just dealing with a criminal. They were dealing with something otherworldly. The first disturbance was not just a murder. It was a declaration. The monster had stepped onto the stage, and Düsseldorf, though it didn't yet know it, was about to become his theater. By 1930, Düsseldorf was living in a state of dread that clung to the air like smoke from the factory chimneys. The city was no longer just afraid of the dark. It was afraid of itself. Every scream in the night, every shadow moving too quickly, every delayed arrival home carried the weight of horror. And Peter Kürten, the invisible puppeteer, thrived on it. The killings began to overlap in strange, unnerving ways. One victim stabbed dozens of times, another strangled, another left with wounds that looked like the work of an animal. The police couldn't piece it together. How could one man commit acts that varied so wildly, as though he were multiple killers inhabiting a single body? Some investigators argued they weren't dealing with one person at all, but a swarm of maniacs stalking the city. Others whispered that the vampire theory made more sense. After all, how else to explain the strange obsession with blood? Newspapers played a dangerous game. On one hand, they craved the sensational details, columns filled with lurid descriptions of wounds, panicked editorials about a city under siege. On the other hand, they feared stoking too much hysteria. The result was confusion, half-truths, and an atmosphere where no one knew what to believe. A woman fainting in the marketplace could spark rumors of another attack. Children dared each other to walk through alleys where the vampire was said to lurk. The line between fact and folklore blurred until it was impossible to separate the two. And then came the letters. Oh yes, the monster couldn't resist writing. Kurten sent anonymous notes to the police and to newspapers, taunting them, describing details only the killer could know. Sometimes the handwriting shook with ecstasy. Other times it was cold, clinical, detached. The letters didn't just reveal his arrogance. They deepened the sense that the city wasn't just under attack, but under surveillance. Somewhere, perhaps even the crowd at a crime scene, the vampire was smiling at the chaos he'd unleashed. The mystery wasn't only about who the killer was. It was about why the killings felt like a performance. It was as though Düsseldorf itself had become a stage, and every scream, every rumor, every newspaper headline was part of the script he was writing. Citizens demanded answers. The police were swamped with false confessions, crackpot tips, and vigilantes prowling the streets. In the fog of paranoia, the question wasn't just who is he, but what is he? Was this a man at all, or had the city birthed a creature that reflected its own post-war decay? The deeper the mystery went, the less human the monster seemed. And that was exactly how Kürten wanted it. The Düsseldorf police were unraveling. Imagine being an investigator staring at crime scene photographs that looked like they belonged to 3 different killers. Stab wounds numbering the dozens, strangulation, blunt force trauma, throats torn open. There was no signature, no consistency. Or so it seemed. Detectives chased theories like desperate gamblers. Some believed the gang was at work, a pact of killers roaming the city for pleasure. Others leaned into the supernatural, whispering off the record that maybe it wasn't entirely human. Still others thought the vampire was just a cover, a grotesque urban myth wrapped around ordinary murders. But ordinary murder doesn't look like this. Ordinary murder doesn't leave bodies drained, letters taunting, and a city paralyzed with primal fear. The police interrogated countless suspects, veterans, vagrants, drifters, anyone with a scar or a suspicious look. They raided boarding houses, interviewed prostitutes, followed men who walked alone at night. Each lead dissolved into nothing. Each failure fed the legend. And in the middle of it all, Kurten played his favorite game, hiding in plain sight. He went out his way to read every newspaper article, to linger near the crowds gawking at fresh crime scenes. He was there, smiling faintly, as detectives scratched their heads over footprints and blood patterns. He sometimes returned to the scenes later, savoring the memory, like a man revisiting the stage of performance where he'd been the star. And then there were the overlooked clues. Witnesses mentioned seeing a man with a calm demeanor, walking away from scenes where screams had just echoed. Police dismissed it. After all, killers are supposed to run. But Kurten didn't run. He strode. He blended. His confidence was a perfect disguise. Forensic science at the time was still primitive. Blood typing existed, but DNA was decades away. Psychology was beginning to poke its head into the world of criminology, but profiling as we know it was non-existent. The notion that someone could kill with such variance, with no clear motive besides desire, baffled the authorities. He didn't fit the molds. He was neither the jealous husband, nor the vengeful worker, nor the career criminal. He was something else entirely, a predator who killed for the sensation, not the result. And still, the theories multiplied. Some said he must be a veteran, a man numbed by trench warfare. Others swore he was a lunatic, escaped from an asylum. One headline even suggested that Düsseldorf was cursed, that the vampire was less a man than a spirit born of Germany's despair. What the police couldn't yet see was that the truth was more terrifying than folklore. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. It was a man who woke up in the morning, kissed his wife, went to work, and then at night slipped into the streets to drink the life out of strangers. For months, Düsseldorf suffocated under a fog of dread. The police stumbling in circles, the public whispering prayers into their pillows. And then, as if fate decided it had grown tired of the masquerade, The cracks in Kürten's mask began to widen. It started with a survivor. Not all of Kürten's victims died. Some crawled away from his shadow, trembling and bloodied, their testimonies clashing with the official theories. One young woman described a man who looked ordinary, almost polite, with calm eyes that betrayed nothing. He hadn't raged or stumbled. He had spoken to her softly, almost tenderly, before turning violent. That detail gnawed at investigators. Most killers fit a profile: drunken rage, jealous frenzy, desperate robbery. But this was intimacy weaponized. Then came the letters. Kurten's arrogance had swollen past containment. He sent a particularly grotesque note to a local newspaper, describing one of his crimes in vivid detail, relishing every line like a poet savoring his stanzas. He wasn't just killing, he was narrating his own legend. The letter rattled investigators. Specifics about the wounds confirmed authenticity. The vampire of Düsseldorf was not only real, but self-aware, hungry for recognition. The breakthrough arrived through an accident of human weakness. Kürten had grown reckless, entangled in an affair with a woman named Maria Budlick. She had fled her abusive home and, in a twist soaked in irony, found herself in the company of the most dangerous man in Germany. At first, he presented himself as a gentleman, offering her help, a place to stay. But when his true nature began to surface, Maria sensed the abyss beneath his civility. Terrified, she escaped, but not before confiding her ordeal in a friend. That friend went to police. The description Maria gave matched fragments from other witnesses. An ordinary man, calm, controlled, not the frenzied brute the police had imagined. Suddenly, the investigation shifted. The monster wasn't a shadow or a legend. He had a face, a body, a name waiting to be uncovered. When the police finally confronted Kürten, it wasn't a blaze of gunfire or a dramatic chase. It was anticlimactic, almost surreal. He surrendered, calmly, almost with relief, as though the performance had exhausted him, and now he longed for the encore. And then the real nightmare began, because once he was in custody, Kürten spoke, and what spilled from his mouth was darker than anything the investigators had ever imagined. He confessed, not just to the murders they suspected, but to dozens of acts stretching back years. Each story delivered with the serenity of a man recalling fond childhood memories. He smiled, he described, he reveled. The turning point wasn't the arrest. It was a realization that Düsseldorf hadn't just been hunting a killer. It had been living alongside a man who knew exactly what he was and loved it. Once Peter Kürten was in chains, Düsseldorf exhaled, but it was a relief. Not really. Relief implies closure, a neat bow tied around chaos. What the city received instead was a torrent of revelations so grotesque that even the newspapers, addicted to sensation, flinched. Kürten confessed to more than murders. He recited a catalog of cruelty: assaults, stabbings, attempted killings, arson set just to watch flames consume. He described how the sight of blood, the final gurgling breaths of victim, gave him something close to transcendence. He admitted to drinking it, to savoring it. He wasn't ashamed, he was proud. Sitting in his cell, he became the director of his own horror opera, forcing the police to listen as he detailed every act like an artist unveiling a gallery. The trial that followed was theater of the macabre. Crowds swarmed the courthouse not out of duty but out of morbid fascination. The prosecution painted Kürten as a calculating monster. The defense tried, feebly, to argue insanity. But Kürten himself? He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be remembered. He leaned into the role of the vampire of Düsseldorf, savoring every headline. And still, the questions lingered. How many victims had there really been? Kürten admitted to dozens of attacks, but some details were contradictory, others unverifiable. Some killings in Düsseldorf during those years remain unsolved, never officially tied to him. Was he exaggerating to inflate his legend? Or had he committed even more atrocities than anyone could prove? Then came the strangest twist. He seemed almost affectionate toward his wife. He confessed, he said, partly so she could claim the reward money offered for information. Imagine that. The vampire who drained children dry, showing tenderness by ensuring his wife might live comfortably after his death. Was it love? Was it manipulation? Or was it just another way to control the narrative, to insert his legend into the veins of those who survived him? When the verdict came, death by guillotine, there was no shock. The city wanted his head, and the state delivered. But the lingering question, the one that never left Düsseldorf, wasn't how will he die? It was, how did he live so long among us? Even in death, Kurten refused to offer closure. He left behind doubts, unsolved threads, an atmosphere where the line between human depravity and supernatural evil blurred forever. Resolution on paper, yes, but in the psyche of the city, lingering questions that refused to be buried. When the blade finally fell on July 2nd, 1931, Germany thought it had closed the book on Peter Kürten. But you can't just guillotine away a nightmare. The city of Düsseldorf carried the scar long after his blood had soaked into the straw beneath the execution scaffold. People whispered about him for years, unable to shake the thought that someone so ordinary could harbor such bottomless cruelty. Kürten's case reshaped criminology. His confessions became a twisted textbook, a study in the psychology of a predator who didn't kill out of necessity or vengeance, but for the ecstasy of it. Investigators, psychiatrists, even authors pored over his words, dissecting them like forensic specimens. He became a grotesque pioneer in the study of sadism, a reminder that monsters aren't mythical. They can be cataloged, interviewed, even quoted. The cultural imprint was immediate. German newspapers dubbed him the Vampire Düsseldorf, the Monster of Düsseldorf, names that echoed through history like urban folklore. His crimes inspired plays, novels, films, the most famous being Fritz Lang's M, which distilled the atmosphere of fear into cinema that still unsettles audiences nearly a century later. Kurten had succeeded in his ultimate desire, immortality through infamy. But beyond culture and criminology, his legacy festered in the human psyche. He had revealed something unbearable, that the face of evil is not grotesque, not monstrous, but disarmingly plain. He wasn't a cloaked vampire, wasn't a supernatural beast. He was a man who held doors, made small talk, and paid his rent. That revelation is far more chilling than fangs and capes. And what of Düsseldorf? The city rebuilt itself, but the shadow lingered. Parents told their children not just fairy tales to keep them close, but real ones, stories of the vampire who once stalked their streets. Even today, his name stains the city's history, a reminder that progress, culture, and civility can all be punctured by the sharp teeth of one man's obsession. In the broader scope, Kurten's crimes raise the uncomfortable question of how societies breed monsters. Was he an aberration, a freak of nature? Or was he the inevitable byproduct of a nation starved, beaten, and traumatized by war? If cruelty was the currency of his childhood, did Germany itself min him? The aftermath wasn't closure. It was legacy, a dark fingerprint on history's throat. Pressed so deep it still throbs when you mention his name. There's a line from Peter Kürten that still rattles the bones of history. On the night before his execution, he turned to his guard and asked, almost casually, almost cheerfully, "Tell me, after my head is cut off, will I still be able to hear, for at least a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Think about that. On the brink of death, staring at the guillotine, most men beg for forgiveness or mercy or God. Kurten asked if he'd have one more taste of ecstasy, one more chance to revel in blood. That wasn't bravado. That wasn't performance. That was his truth. It forces us to confront something grotesque, The abyss doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it walks beside us, wears a hat, smiles politely, and waits until the street is empty. Kurten wasn't a demon in folklore. He was worse. He was proof that the line between ordinary humanity and bottomless depravity is paper thin, and sometimes it tears. And here's the most unsettling part. Düsseldorf's vampire didn't vanish with the guillotine. He lingers. Every city has its shadows, its forgotten alleys, its faces you don't look at too long on the tram. Every time you hear a late-night scream in the distance and tell yourself it was nothing, every time you walk a little faster because footsteps echo behind you, that's his legacy. Not just the crimes, but the paranoia that monsters don't need wings or fangs. They only need the desire to see you bleed. Maybe that's why his story endures. Not because we like to shudder at gothic nicknames, but because deep down, we know he wasn't unique. He was a mirror, reflecting what happens when cruelty is nurtured instead of extinguished, when violence becomes language, when pain becomes art. The guillotine ended Peter Kürten, but the terror he represents, that's eternal, and it's waiting, patient as ever in the dark. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.